Welcome to today's edition of One Slot. I am Rita Omodia. Now, commemorated every year on February 20, the World Day of Social Justice aims at tackling issues such as poverty, exclusion, gender inequality, unemployment, social protections, and human rights. The growing divide in the world today has necessitated a greater call for a more inclusive and networked society. But social justice is under attack in several countries between the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel zone, with disparities that undermine the rights of populations due to various conflicts. On today's episode of One Slot, we will be looking at expanding opportunities for social justice in Southern Africa. Now, within this region, South Africa is seen as the world's most unequal country, a global position not just within the continent. The present government has made significant progress regarding the provision of basic services and broadening the social wage. However, the unfortunate reality is that inequality grew since the advent of democracy over 20 years ago. For some, the continuity, depth, and breadth of inequality, including the extraordinary financial and social costs, is linked to the legacy of apartheid. This year's theme focuses on the recommendations of the Common Agenda to strengthen global solidarity and to rebuild trust in government by overcoming barriers and unleashing opportunities for social justice. And now joining us for this conversation is Tony Ehrenreich, Deputy Coordinator, Parliamentary Office, Congress of South African Trade Unions, Cape Town, South Africa. Ehrenreich joined COSATU in 1989, raising to become its National Deputy General Secretary from 1999 to 2001. He represented COSATU at the World Trade Organization in Doha, International Confederation of Labour Trade Committee in Geneva, Organization of African Trade Union Unity in Ghana, and unions bilateral with French trade unions in Paris. Thank you so much for joining us, Tony, on One Slot.
Thank you.
And so you've dealt with so much about labor organizations, talking about social justice. So definitely you would be able to tell us what exactly social justice is and why exactly it is so important in a society.
Well, I think as those who reside on the African continent, we know what the opposite of social justice is. The horrendous of colonialism, the horrors of apartheid that we experienced in South Africa, and many, many flavors of the violence and the brutality and the underdevelopment caused by colonialism from many of those colonial powers, who today still hold on to their vested, stolen interest in those countries that they occupied, and in that way undermining its developmental agenda in pursuit of the interest of its own natural inhabitants. So we know that as a result of colonialism, we have to both undo the colonial control that still resides in many areas of our economies, in Africa in particular, but we've also got to ensure that as we transform our society, that it undoes the features of colonialism. And unemployment, poverty, underdevelopment, gender oppression, violence in many of its forms are all features of what the colonial empires had brought into the continent, and that continues to wreak havoc in our societies today. And so we've got to, as part of a global effort towards building a more just and a more democratic and equitable and equal society, advance those objectives within our countries. In South Africa, we know firsthand that many of the promises that we made, the liberation promises to undo the legacy of apartheid, was about restoring and rebuilding the social fabric of our societies. And so employment opportunities, an end to the huge levels of inequalities, ensuring that we're able to maintain our sovereignty over where our country goes and what it does, as all important steps in the plan to rebuild social justice in our societies. And so that's got to be a key part of the program going forward in South Africa and in the African continent as a whole.
I'm going to come later down to Southern Africa and South Africa, which I know you have lots of experiences on. But generally, what exactly are the basic principles? When you say you have social justice in society, what are the basic principles that should be inherent in society before you can say that there is social justice?
Well, there's a number of features. We've got to make sure that there's freedom of association, so the right for people to join trade unions must be sacrosanct. And in South Africa, freedom of association is guaranteed in the Constitution. We, however, know that in many of our neighboring countries, those governments are not as warm to workers joining trade unions as an important part of democratizing the workplace in undoing those colonial features of the economic development in Africa. So freedom of association is absolutely essential. Then the provision of basic services in our society. This is water, education, electricity, sanitation, proper health services, opportunities for people to engage in skill, to pursue economic activities, to be able to enrich their lives, and all of those democratic principles that we take for granted in many of the European and developed societies. That's got to become a feature of the South African societies also. So many of those features are included in a lot of the United Nations declarations, including the conventions at the ILO that defend the right of workers. So it's that kind of democratic structures that's absolutely essential for taking forward social justice as an important imperative of a developing society. So we've made some strides in South Africa, and we know across the globe and across the continent, we've seen advances in many of those areas. But we've also seen that there's been many failures. One of the biggest weaknesses of South African society is that we have seemed to have inherited a disproportionate sense of corrupt politicians. When you see a politician having more and much more wealth than the general population of the society that he's supposed to serve his constituency in, you must know that that's not a good politician. Because a politician who comes to the leadership in the political arena to enrich himself has no role in playing a leadership role in our society. So that's one of the first things we must do, is reject these corrupt politicians with their point shoes and their $1,000 suits. We've got to ensure that the political leaders that are put in place to advance the ambitions of social justice in our society, and that they themselves should live a life that's morally acceptable to the population, but also that it is imbued with integrity, so that we know he is not somebody who's going to sell out its society and its people for a seat at the table where the riches are carved up, but that it is a representative of people, ensuring that people are the key beneficiaries of the democratic project in those countries to grow the economy and expand the society in all of those areas of social delivery.
Okay, now looking at this disparities, I mean, you mentioned colonialism, you mentioned apartheid, and we also know that there are a lot of issues that came up when COVID-19 pandemic came, and there's the talk of unequal distribution of vaccines. And when we talk about social justice, we're talking about equal distribution of resources and opportunities. Now, placing the African continent, I mean, we've also had discussions on the fact that the African continent or the African Union should be part of the United Nations Security Council. So there's been a protest over the fact that Africa as a continent has been left behind, and that there's been an unjustifiable distribution of resources and opportunities. How have governments helped in making sure that African countries are top on the position when put beside the Western countries?
Well, absolutely. I think that that's absolutely essential. And when you talk about the fact that we've got to be included in the structures of the United Nations, the Security Council and many others are absolutely essential for the expression of the African interest. But while we are part of the discussions that look at security and threats in many areas of Africa, we've got to make sure that the way in which the economies of those countries develop is in line with its ability to take care of the needs of its people. We still have our connection into global value chains and supply chains where we play a secondary role. The World Trade Organization continues to allow many of the European Union member states as well as the United States to have all kinds of support for their industry, and they demand that we take away the support for our industries, and they're able to export their products into our markets that supports their jobs, supports their GDP growth, and undermine ours. So clearly, we've got to have a more equitable outcome in how global economic relations are structured. And the World Trade Organization is an absolutely essential one of those agencies to make sure that we are able to bring about greater equality. At the moment, we can clearly see that the developed countries, whether it's the United States or big sections of the European Union and many parts of the East Asian countries, are not concerned about our developmental needs. And we've got to ensure that we put that at the top of the agenda, that when we trade with countries, it must be in the interest of our people, to the benefit of our people, to both ensure that we're able to develop our productive forces and that we're able to become part of the global value chains and the global economy. At the moment, that's not happening. And we are often surprised as to why our political leaders so easily succumb and give into the framework and the philosophy that's put in place by the developed countries.
So, Tony, would you say African governments have not done enough to try and level up to this social injustice going on around the world? What have African governments done about it?
They absolutely have not done enough, and South Africa is probably one of the examples. We, after the end of apartheid, had first entered into free trade agreements and special trade agreements with the European Union and the United States. And only now, 25 years into our democracy, are we in any meaningful way talking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as a key feature of what will drive growth on the African continent and bring about great development. So our leaders have failed us. And it's partly because many of the leaders have ingratiated and become assimilated into the lifestyles of the European Union. So we shouldn't be surprised when many leaders and their families go abroad, shopping excursions, or for health services. So they have access to the best of services in developing countries, but they're not ensuring that the same provision of services take place in the developing economies. So many of our leaders are not keeping true to the focus of development that should be underpinning the South African and the African continental development, and that's got to be a key consideration going forward. So what we'd like to see is that we have integrated economies where the value chains and the supply chains on the African continent are leading to job creation, the development of industrial capacity in all of the economies around us. And we can't only have South Africa being a sea of prosperity in a globe of poverty. We've got to find ways to ensure that the development, that the pursuit of human rights, that happens at an equal level at the developing economies and at the developed economies, and particularly in Africa.
Now, I'm surprised you mentioned South Africa. I mean, out of all the countries during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw President Cyril Ramaphosa talk a whole lot about African countries building up their own vaccines and making sure that they have the legal status to produce their vaccines. So wouldn't you say that the government at least spoke up during that period when a lot of people felt that there was a lot of inequality between African countries and the Western world?
Of course, our responses to the COVID and what happened in Africa was certainly not in keeping with what was happening internationally. And South Africa was streets ahead of what happened in the rest of the economy. And President Cyril Ramaphosa had made the right noises. We now do have some capacity for vaccine development in South Africa that can service the continent as a whole. But these are measures that you must appreciate that come in place 27 years after our democracy in South Africa. These are steps that should have been in place long ago. We should have had a state-owned pharmaceutical company with the supply and distribution channels in the rest of the continent, so that all of our people on the continent have access to all of the vaccines that are required for a range of diseases that still troubles the African continent more than it does the developed world. So great stuff that we're able to, in this COVID pandemic, come up with some measures as South Africa, supported by many of the neighboring countries that we have. But why only 27 years into democracy? Why is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement only now coming to fruition? So we appreciate that it's there, And we now want to see that the measures are expanded to ensure that the continent's development is uppermost in their minds. And so what we've got to ensure is that many of our political leaders who serve on the boards of those multinational companies, that we take them off those boards. If we do need representatives on those boards, let's take members from civil society that's properly empowered to play that role. But politicians are selling out our countrymen to be able to put their fingers into the pockets of those big multinational corporations. And we've got to close down that space for them. Our politicians merely look as if they have better suits than the developing countries, than the developed countries' politicians. And that clearly is significant, or a key indicator of where their priorities are. They want to look good, but they're not doing as much good as they should be doing in the continent for the African communities firstly, and then they should be worried about how shiny their shoes are.
Definitely, we'll definitely be looking at how to expand these opportunities. Tony, right now, we'll take a breather and we'll be talking about situations in South Africa. As we well know, social inequality is a serious feature in the structure and precarious ordering of societies today. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at social injustice in the southern region with major focus in South Africa. Do stay with us.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa First.
Thanks for staying with us. In the one slot, we've been looking at how to expand the social injustice in the African continent, and of course, with a major focus in southern African regions and South Africa. Now, according to a 2022 World Bank report, South Africa, the largest country in the Southern African Customs Union, SACU, is the most, unfortunately, unequal country in the world, with race playing a determining factor. It ranks first among 164 countries in the World Bank's Global Poverty Database. Botswana, Eswatini, and Namibia are among the 15 most unequal countries, despite recent improvements. Now, still with us on the one slot is Tony Ehrenreich, is the Deputy Coordinator, Parliamentary Office, Congress of South African Trade Unions, Cape Town, South Africa. Thanks once again for staying with us on one slot. And right now, we're dealing deep with emphases on the Southern African region. I mean, on the first half, before we went on break, you talked about how much governments have left the gap, widened the gap of social injustices and inequality on the African continent when compared to the Western world. Now, what is the current stage of social justice in Southern Africa?
Well, let me start by South Africa and say that South Africa today is a more unequal society than what it was under apartheid. Now, that must be the clearest indication that our policy route that we've chosen is not the appropriate one, because there was a horrendous system of exploitation under apartheid that excluded black people from political activity and undermined them in all areas of society. Yet today, in a democratic environment, the country is more unequal than what it was under apartheid. But we see our politicians doing really well, becoming more and more like fat cats, becoming assimilated into the capitalist class in South Africa. And that is the case in probably most of the custom union countries on our borders. That what we've seen is that politicians are quick to enrich themselves and to have all the features and the trimmings of really extravagant leaders in a society. Now, for us in South Africa, if you have that level of extravagance and you're spending more on your shoe allowance than you are on focusing on the needs of the people in your country, then clearly you're not the appropriate leader for that country. And that should be the first way in which we should identify people who should be disqualified from leadership in the African continent. If you want to enrich yourself, go to business or become a real criminal. You can't use the political system for your criminal activities to enrich yourself. And that, unfortunately, is the case for about 90% of politicians on the African continent. We've got to make sure that the 10%, those concerned about social justice, about lifting up quality of lives of our people, that those are the people we put into leadership position, and not those who are there to wear a brighter suit every day and enrich themselves, their families and their cronies at the cost of the poor people in our country.
Now, Tony, from what you're saying, bad leadership with low focus on the citizenry has led to a lot of social injustices in the society, especially in South Africa. What are these social issues that have been birthed from bad leadership? What are the issues specifically, especially in South Africa?
Well, one of the biggest issues is that today we have an unemployment level of above 40%. Unemployment was around 16, 19% in 1994. Today it's at 42%. A whole range of international factors have had a bearing on that, but it's also been the choices that leaders have made in the country that have not been aligned to the interest of the majority of poor people, poor African people, where the policy should have been directed at. So we see that many of the black economic empowerment elite has been taken up by black politicians or by the black elite. And today to have a president who's a billionaire is testimony to the problems that we have in South Africa. How can it be that the wealthy classes in South Africa has enriched the leader of the African communities in South Africa to such an extent that he's a billionaire, that he counts amongst the richest whites who stole under apartheid, but they're now wanting to ensure that they integrate part of the black elite so that they're politically protected in the country, the white elite who stole under apartheid. And many of our black leaders are just falling into those traps. They're not focusing on making sure that we improve the lives of our people, and they rather want to find a way in which they themselves can be integrated into what is probably largely defined as the economy that was stolen under apartheid, and today continues to see the wealthiest people in our country. And not only South Africa, you're right about South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, many of these economies are still controlled by the old white elites who stole the wealth under apartheid, and today have black partners that give them political legitimacy. And that is the unfortunate and the sad reality of many African countries. And that's something we've got to exchange and turn around in the immediate future if we want to see more socially just outcome.
Now, you've made major emphasis on bad leadership, and you would know that with a lot of power, there's always an abuse of power, and that's why there should be checks and balances for governments. So aside the politicians who have actually contributed to lots of social injustices going on the African continent and in South Africa, what about the institutions? Are there any legal processes, legal procedures, legislations that will support and promote social injustices and also put a nab into social injustices going on?
I think we have been able to, and we've seen that in South Africa, build many powerful institutions which are having an impact in closing the inequality gap. And so in South Africa, a great example is the Competition Commission, who's making sure that the areas of the economy where they used to have a lack of competition and where they have monopolies in certain parts of the economy and they could control, we still have many of those problems. We've had instances in South Africa where there's been collusion around the bread prices. Now, collusion is just a fancy word for corruption around the bread prices and meat, chicken portions, and the building of stadiums. So we've seen that in the private sector, the deep levels of corruption that existed under apartheid is still there. But we also see it in many of the political leaders. And so the institutional mechanisms that have been built are helped. The Competition Commission, the Companies Act, many areas of legislation that ensures that the way in which the elites had controlled the economy in the past, that is undone. But we're not undoing it fast enough, because what we still see taking place is that the levels of inequality is increasing. And if any indicator of the success of policy in South Africa, it must be that we're moving higher up in the areas that takes us closer to greater social justice. And so we want to see some of the institutions that we've built in South Africa being extended across the continent so that we're able to hold those who have enriched themselves to greater levels of accountability. And so it's about building institutions. But it's also making sure that the logic of the free market system is not allowed to trump all other considerations. And so the wealthy in our country would want to see no laws that constrains the power of capital or that restricts the measures or steps that they can take to ensure that it doesn't become more unequal. And those steps has to be expanded across the continent, and we've got to hold people to accountable. We have many areas of legislation in place that deals with the race question, but we have very little legislation that deals with the class question. And class formation in South Africa and on the African continent is taking place at a rapid rate, where the old elites that were part of colonialism and part of institutions and systems like apartheid are continuing to control those economies and are now just looking for black partners so that they can have political legitimacy. We must be careful that we don't subject ourselves to that logic,